Hi everybody, this is Dr. Oxley, and this week there were no good YouTube videos on our topic, which is virtue ethics. So I've decided just to make a quick video of my own, which is going to highlight the main points that you're going to need to know about virtue ethics in order to make sense of it. This week the reading is by Rosalind Hursthouse, and it's a slightly difficult reading, so I've decided to at least give you some introductory notes, which is going to help you make sense of the reading. So what I'll do in this video is to give you some background on virtue ethics and tell you the difference between virtue ethics and the other theories that we've talked about so far, utilitarianism and Kantian ethics. And then after that, I'm going to give you just an example of virtue ethics so that you can have a better idea of what Hursthouse is talking about when you read that essay. So the main difference between virtue ethics and the other theories that we've talked about, utilitarianism and Kantian ethics, is that it tends to focus on what's called the agent. That just means a person, instead of focusing on right actions. So you'll remember that utilitarianism, for example, defines a right action as one that maximizes overall utility or happiness for everyone. And so the aim of the theory is to say, here's what a right action is so that you can go out and do it. Now the difference is that virtue ethics has always talked about not just actions, but the kind of person that you should be. So for example, virtue ethics says that you need to be a loyal person and an honest person or a just person, and not just perform loyal actions or honest actions or just actions. They, in other words, emphasize the development of character and who it is that you are becoming as an individual. So most, for example, of our child-rearing techniques have focused on what it means to be a good person. So when your mom was raising you, or your dad, or your grandparents, or whoever, they would say things like, you need to be this kind of person, and try to develop your character, and you develop your character by doing things habitually. So it's not just good enough to tell the truth one time, you need to tell the truth continually and habitually, and that way you get the reputation as being an honest person. So that's the primary difference between virtue ethics and the other theories that we've talked about. So Hursthouse is going to talk about that in her essay, because she's going to confront the objection which says that virtue ethics doesn't really tell you what to do. In other words, it doesn't tell you what kind of action it is that you should take. And so she spends her essay, the time in her essay, responding to that particular objection. So at least that's one of the objections that she talks about. So there are a couple of fancy words that are often used when talking about virtue ethics, and these are Greek derivatives. And I'll just talk for a minute about those terms because they are at the heart of virtue ethics, and the father of virtue ethics was the first person to talk about these, and that was Aristotle. You've probably heard Aristotle's name before, and he, as I said, is considered the father of virtue ethics. Aristotle's central idea was that we need to become, for example, just, brave, or temperate, and that we develop these kinds of habits over time, and that eventually you come to develop a disposition to respond in a certain way when you're confronted in a certain situation, and then that sort of is the true test that you can respond in the correct moral way when you're confronted with a moral dilemma. So Aristotle had a really specific idea of what a virtue was, and this is called the doctrine of the mean, and I've put this on your handout. The doctrine of the mean says that a virtue is the mean between two extremes, and the extremes are, on the one side, excess of having a certain, what you might call character trait or something, and on the other end, the deficiency. So the example that Aristotle gives is called courage. And Aristotle says that courage is the mean between these two extremes, the extremes being, on the one hand, being pusillanimous or being a wimp, and on the other hand, of being foolhardy. So Aristotle says, okay, somebody could be really wimpy, and they would be afraid to go into battle, and they would run away when the general told them that they needed to rush the field, and this would be a deficiency of courage. On the other hand, Somebody might say, hey, I'll go into battle at any moment, and I don't care if I'm outnumbered 50 to 1. Woohoo! Well, Aristotle is going to say that's, on the other hand, not a virtue either. That's also a vice because you're in the extreme of being foolhardy. So Aristotle says that the virtuous person is the one that is both appropriately afraid and yet also appropriately brave. And when you combine those two or those two qualities, then you can come up with the virtue which he calls courage. Most philosophers have been pretty persuaded by Aristotle that this is in fact a very good definition of what a virtue is. So for the most part, there hasn't been too much criticism of Aristotle's idea of a virtue over the years. It's rather just that there's been discussion of additional virtues or virtues that are in fact shaped according to the society in which you live or the period of history in which you live, and that virtues tend to change over time. So it may be the case that there are some virtues that we would consider universal virtues, that they're virtues in all cultures and over all periods of time. Justice, for example, might be one of these, or honesty. But there are other kinds of virtues that are not necessarily, that were considered virtues, but for example aren't now considered virtues. Chastity is a good example. This used to be a virtue in the Middle Ages, and if you watch MTV or VH1 these days, you will certainly seem to think that chastity is definitely not a virtue anymore. Of course, your personal convictions, you might have personal convictions that say, well, of course chastity is a virtue. So some of our virtues are held by the entire society, and some virtues tend to be held by individuals alone. Let me get now to those fancy Greek words that Aristotle used and which are now used in virtue ethics. The first of those terms is called arete. That just means excellence. So you will see in the writing that people talk about aretaic concepts. That just means concepts that have to do with goodness or flourishing or have to do with an excellence, that this is, it's a value judgment that we're making about this thing. The other concept that's used is called eudaimonia. This is on your handout, and I'll leave it for you to look at the handout to figure out how to spell it. And eudaimonia means, in Greek, it means blessedness. Another translation is that is called contentedness, and happiness is not quite the same thing because it doesn't have the right connotation. But eudaimonia, says Aristotle, is the thing that all human beings are searching after. We are trying to become good people, and he envisions our actions as constantly we're aiming towards like a target. It's like target practice. So you have a bullseye in the center, and every time we perform an action, we try to get close to that bullseye. So Aristotle says, for example, that a right action is one that is performed at the right time, in the right way, with the right person, in the right manner, etc., etc. So as you can see, he has a much more complicated idea about what it means to perform a good action. It's not just, maximizing overall utility or respecting someone as an end in themselves. There's a whole lot of other features that go into performing a right action, and it's a lot more complicated. A lot of people think that Aristotle's view of a right action is actually more correct with what we think that a moral judgment really is about, because we do judge people in terms of whether they've done something in the right way. It's not just telling the truth that matters, but telling it in the right way. That pretty much wraps up my summary of virtue ethics and a little bit of Aristotle's virtue ethics. Remember that in the essay that you're supposed to read for this week, Rosalind Hurstthouse's essay, what she's trying to do is to provide a picture or a formulation of virtue ethics that will contextualize it or situate it so that it can compete with these other two theories. What she ends up trying to do is say a right action is one that, and then she says, it's one that a virtuous person does. Now you can ask yourself whether this works or not, and definitely read her essay because she goes into a lot more detail explaining how it is that virtue ethics can indeed offer direction and guidance in terms of how to act morally. I'll look forward to seeing what you have to say about that. Thanks.